The morning sun crept gently over the spires of Ethelmaris, gilding the stone towers in soft gold. It was a kingdom known for its icy rivers and iron-handed warlords, yet its throne was held by a man who preferred the rustle of parchment to the clang of steel. King Aldric III was unlike any ruler who came before him. While his ancestors etched their names into history with conquests and executions, Aldric had done the unthinkable: he chose peace. He ended border skirmishes with the Highland clans through quiet diplomacy, and he turned down a crusade against the southern tribes in favor of a trade pact. At court, they called him the Candle King, a dim, flickering light compared to the torches of his forebears. But outside the palace, the people whispered of his kindness. A tax relief granted during a drought. A mason's child treated in the royal infirmary without charge. A law that protected stabled animals from abuse. The common folk saw in Aldric something rare. A monarch with a soul. And yet, that soul had no home among the nobility. The court did not understand him. He walked through the marble halls of House Virulin like a ghost, nodding politely, rarely speaking, his mind far away. He seemed to carry a loneliness he could not name. His chambers were bare of gold or trophies. He kept no mistress, no favored knight, and had never married, a curiosity that gave birth to murmurs. What filled the void in him was not a person, but a creature, a towering, coal-colored stallion named Myrrel. Aldric received the horse as a diplomatic gift from an Andalusian prince 5 winters ago. Most kings would have ridden it in parades. Aldric did not. Instead, he visited the stables each dusk, bringing Myrrel slices of apples and speaking to him as if the beast understood every word. To the stable hands, it was endearing at first. They chuckled when the king recited poetry aloud, sitting on a bale of hay as Myrrel stood beside him like a loyal sentinel. But over time, laughter faded into confusion. Aldric spent more and more hours away from the court, alone in the stables. There were nights he did not return to his chambers, and mornings when his robes smelled faintly of straw and cedar. Kings do not whisper to horses, one noblewoman remarked with a sneer. Unless they have nothing else to love. But Aldric did love, deeply, silently, and without fanfare. Not in the way courtly songs dictated, but in the manner of a man who found honesty only in the eyes of an animal. Myrrel never lied. Myrrel never schemed. When Aldric pressed his forehead to the stallion's broad neck, he felt something he could not explain, not romance, not lust, but connection. In a world built on treachery, that connection was sacred. Still, the halls of power are cold toward mystery. Unexplained behavior becomes a stain. And stains, when left to fester, become scandal. The bishop had already raised a quiet concern: the king was too reclusive. The chancellor grumbled that Aldric refused to discuss heirs. The nobles murmured over wine that the Candle King burned too softly, and the flame of the realm would soon die. None of this reached Aldric's ears. Or perhaps it did, and he chose not to hear it. Instead, he retreated further into silence. His writings became darker, more introspective. He scribbled lines of verse on the backs of decrees, notes that courtiers tossed aside as madness. But to him, they were confessions, the only way he knew to explain himself in a language the world did not speak. In the quiet corners of the stable, where oil lamps cast shadows on the straw, Aldric found peace. Myrrel would breathe beside him, warm and alive, while the kingdom outside festered with doubt. But peace, in a royal court, is a dangerous thing. And soon, the silence that shielded Aldric would crack, letting in a poison he never saw coming. It began with a whisper, thin as thread, sharp as glass, winding through the corridors of the court like a snake in silk. No one knew who said it first, but within days, servants murmured it over chamber pots and kitchen scraps. The phrase was short, vulgar, absurd. And yet, in a palace built on appearances, absurdity had power. The king has grown too fond of his horse. In another place, in another age, it might have died as a tasteless jest. But in Ethelmaris, in the year of high harvest, it fell like a seed on ready soil, and in that soil grew something poisonous. At the center of this rot stood Duke Renald of Valenne, cousin to the king, master of smiles. He had waited years in the shadow of Aldric, draping his ambition in the fabric of loyalty. But loyalty, to Renald, was a performance, a dance until the music changed. And now, he heard a new tune playing. Renald knew Aldric had few defenders in court. No queen. No heir. No close allies among the barons. A king who walked alone was easy to isolate. A king who wandered the stables in the dark, murmuring sonnets to a stallion, was easier still. So Renald added oil to rumor. He spoke in half-sentences, let his eyes widen at key moments, raised his brow in feigned disbelief. He never accused, not directly. He didn't have to. The court was a web of suspicion, and all he needed to do was tremble one thread. Lady Corienne claimed to have seen Aldric touch the horse's muzzle, too tenderly. A knight's squire said the king once fell asleep in the hay beside the beast. None of it was proof. All of it was theater. And Renald was the conductor. But the final stroke came from a stable boy named Callan. Callan was 13, desperate, and terrified of losing the coin that fed his mother. One night, he was summoned privately. Renald leaned in close, speaking in a voice lined with honey and venom. "Say what I need, and you'll eat like a lord," he promised. "Refuse, and your mother finds herself homeless." The next morning, Callan wept in front of the High Council. His tale was shaky but vivid, a scene painted with trembling hands, the king alone at night, whispering and, moving strangely, near the horse. He claimed to have seen what should never be seen. There were no questions, no cross-examinations. Only gasps. The silence that followed was not disbelief, it was the sound of reputations collapsing. The church reacted swiftly. Bishop Elmont declared that unnatural affection was a perversion not only of man's soul but of God's natural order. The nobles echoed him. Fear, already festering in their minds, bloomed into outrage. They spoke not of justice, but of shame, of a stain on the kingdom's dignity. In that moment, Aldric's love of poetry became deviance. His solitude became suspicion. His gentleness, weakness. No one mentioned his acts of mercy. No one remembered the treaties he signed, the bloodshed he prevented. They remembered only straw. Silence. And the horse. He was summoned before the council, not as king, but as a man accused. He did not cry. He did not plead. He merely looked at them, all of them, with an expression carved from grief, not guilt. "You speak of filth," he said softly, "but your words reek more than anything I have done." They did not let him finish. Duke Renald, resplendent in blue velvet, rose and demanded exile. "Not for guilt," he said, with mock sadness, "but for the good of the realm." There were nods. The decision was swift, brutal, and final. No trial. No protest. No truth. Just a door closing behind a king who once lit a kingdom with kindness, now buried under rumor. That evening, as Aldric walked through the castle gates for the last time, Myrrel followed without command. No reins. No saddle. Just hoofbeats beside footsteps, and eyes watching from high windows that would never see justice. The whisper had become law. The stain, permanent. And the king who had ruled with compassion walked silently into exile. Betrayed not by his people, but by the ones who claimed to speak for them. The gates slammed shut behind Aldric with a finality that echoed louder than any shout. The weight of his exile pressed down like a stone on his chest, yet he did not resist. There was no rebellion in his heart, only the ache of betrayal and the hollow silence of a throne emptied of its king. In the weeks before his departure, the court had been suffocating with whispers. Not one soul stepped forward to defend him. Friends vanished like shadows at dusk. Even those who once admired his gentleness now avoided his gaze, as though his presence threatened their own fragile standing. Aldrich moved through the palace halls with a quiet dignity that both stunned and unsettled the onlookers. His silence was more powerful than any argument. When asked to explain himself, he offered only a faint smile, a sad acknowledgement of a world that had turned against him. Behind closed doors, the council debated endlessly, but their voices were never meant for Aldrich's ears. Decisions were made in hushed tones, by men and women who saw him less as a monarch and more as a liability. To them, exile was mercy, to Aldrich, it was a slow death. He was granted a small retinue, a handful of loyal servants and Myrrel, his steadfast companion. They accompanied him not as a royal procession but as an escort to oblivion. The journey from the capital was filled with stares from townsfolk who had once cheered his name but now averted their eyes, caught between pity and fear. At the border, the guards refused to look back as Aldrich passed. The last glimmer of his kingdom lay behind the towering stone walls, now nothing more than a memory swallowed by mist. The abbey where Aldrich took refuge was a forgotten place, its stones weathered and crumbling, mirroring the decay of his own spirit. Here, the echoes of prayers long silenced filled the air, and the cold seeped into bones and heart alike. Days turned into nights without distinction. Aldrich walked the overgrown gardens, Myrrel grazing silently beside him. Words failed him. The poetry that once flowed effortlessly became jagged fragments scribbled hastily on scraps of parchment. His verses spoke of loss, of trust broken, and of a world too harsh for a soul like his. The weight of silence grew heavier with each passing dawn, but still, Aldrich bore it without bitterness. He did not curse those who condemned him. Instead, he searched for meaning in exile's cruel embrace. His love for Myrrel remained his sole anchor, a living proof that companionship could survive even in desolation. News from the capital arrived sporadically, carried by travelers and merchants. Each report was a dagger. The kingdom moved on, indifferent and unkind. Rinald's influence tightened like a noose around the throne, and the truth of Aldrich's innocence was buried beneath layers of deception. Yet, despite everything, Aldrich did not break. His silence became a shield, a testament to resilience rather than defeat. In solitude, he found a strange freedom, free from the chains of expectation, free from the poison of rumor. The world had crushed his crown, but it had not destroyed his spirit. The bitter winds of the north bit through the cracked windows of the abandoned abbey, carrying with them the chill of years forgotten. Snow fell relentlessly, blanketing the world outside in silent white, but inside, the cold was not just a matter of weather, it seeped into the marrow of Aldrich's exile, marking every moment with relentless solitude. Here, far from the golden halls of Ethelmaris, time stretched thin and slow. Days bled into nights, and nights folded back into days with no grand distinction. The only constant was the rhythmic breathing of Myrrel, whose warm flank pressed close as if sensing the king's growing despair. Aldrich's hands, once so steady in signing decrees and holding court, now trembled as they clutched a quill. The ink on his parchment blurred with each word, a fragile testament to a mind wrestling against the shadow of oblivion. His poetry, once delicate and hopeful, turned somber, steeped in the loneliness that wrapped around him like a shroud. He wrote of frost that numbed the heart, of promises broken like brittle ice, and of a throne abandoned not by fate but by the treachery of men. Myrrel was his sole audience. The horse's dark eyes held a quiet understanding, a bridge between two souls exiled by circumstance. Aldrich found comfort in the creature's presence, in the steady warmth that defied the harshness of their world. Yet, beneath the companionship lay a gnawing ache, the sting of being cast out, not for crime or failure, but for a lie whispered in shadows. The king grappled with memories of laughter turned to whispers, of allies turned to strangers, and of a kingdom that had chosen silence over truth. Outside, the forest pressed close, its skeletal branches scratching against stone walls like the claws of regret. Wolves howled in the distance, reminders of a wildness Aldrich no longer belonged to but could not escape. The nights were the hardest. In the flickering glow of a dying fire, he faced the vast emptiness within himself. Questions circled endlessly. Had he been too gentle? Too distant? Was his love for Myrrel a sin or simply a refuge from a world too cruel? But answers did not come. Only the cold, the dark, and the ink-stained pages bearing witness to a soul slowly unraveling. The abbey's ruins became a sanctuary of sorrow and reflection. Moss crept over forgotten altars, just as grief settled over Aldrich's heart. He was no longer a king in exile, he was a man stripped bare, searching for meaning in silence. Still, amid the desolation, a flicker remained, a stubborn ember of hope. Perhaps someday, far beyond the horizon of his suffering, the truth would find its voice. Perhaps the world would see beyond the lies. Until then, Aldrich wrote. And Myrrel waited. News traveled slow and crooked through the villages beyond the capital. But it reached Aldrich's ears, carried on the brittle wings of rumor and the trembling voices of travelers. The kingdom he had once ruled was changing, and not for the better. Duke Renaud, the architect of his exile, had not only seized power, he had woven a web of deception so thick that even the brightest minds were ensnared. Laws were rewritten in the shadows, alliances shifted like sand, and the people's faith wavered beneath the weight of uncertainty. The once vibrant court became a stage for hollow pageantry, where loyalty was currency and truth a forgotten relic. Those who had whispered behind Aldrich's back now paraded their false piety openly, their smiles sharper than daggers. But the deepest wound was not the loss of his crown or the betrayal of his peers, it was the silence of those he loved. Faces that had once shone with warmth now turned away, hands that had once offered friendship now clenched into fists. The king's absence left a void filled with cold indifference. Aldrich learned this in the quiet moments, when Myrrel nuzzled his shoulder and the world's noise fell away. Memories flickered like fragile embers, the laughter of a childhood friend, the soft touch of a loyal advisor, the unspoken bond of a trusted knight. Each was now a ghost, haunting a past that had been erased. The betrayal was not loud. It did not roar from banners or clatter from swords. It whispered in empty halls and lingered in unanswered letters. It was the absence of a voice when one was needed most. From the shadows, Aldrich watched as his kingdom withered under the weight of lies. The people, confused and fearful, sought answers in the promises of a ruler who wore Renaud's face. But no promise could mend the fracture carved by betrayal's silent hand. Yet, even as hope dimmed, Aldrich's heart refused to break completely. In the cold solitude of exile, he discovered a new kind of strength, one forged not in the heat of battle but in the quiet endurance of suffering. He wrote letters he never sent, pouring truth onto parchment that the world had forgotten. He dreamed of a day when justice would be more than a word whispered in fear. And Myrrel, ever faithful, remained beside him, a living reminder that even in betrayal, loyalty could endure. If you like this story, stay with us. Don't forget to like, comment and share, also subscribe to our channel for such more convenient historical stories.